Well, this week, or this last week, I should say, we've lost two civil rights icons, C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. Hebrews 12:1-2 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God." Both these men worked tirelessly to dismantle racism out of their faith commitment, to work toward justice in a nonviolent way. It is on their shoulders and many others like Rosa Parks, Vincent Harding, and Martin Luther King that the Black Lives Movement is now the work we are called to embrace and work toward the long-awaited justice for many people of color. One of the subjects we're going to discuss today is white supremacy. And it's hard for us as Christians to think that our faith has been tainted by white supremacy. One of my favorite books, entitled Columbus and Other Cannibals, written by Jack Forbes, has some provocative in his book illustrating white supremacy. Jack was a Native American, a professor of Native American Studies at UC. Jack was Lelampe and Relampe. One of the quotes in his book is from Lame Deer, a holy man among the Lakota. And in 1972, 4 years before Lame Deer died, he said this about Jesus. He said, you made a blondie out of Jesus. I don't care for those blonde, blue-eyed pictures of a sanitized, Cloroxed, Ajaxed Christ. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a yellow-haired Anglo. I'm sure he had black hair and dark skin like an Indian. The white ranchers around here would step out with their daughters. His religion came out of the desert in which he lived, out of the kind of mountains, his kind of animals, his kind of plants. You try to make him into an Anglo-Saxon Fuller Brush salesman, a long-haired Billy Graham in a fancy nightshirt. And that's why he doesn't work for you anymore. He was a good medicine man, I guess. Historically, Christian churches have spent millions of dollars evangelizing Native Americans by running and supporting, going onto their reservations to start churches, participating in trying to destroy their culture and spirituality. The results are only 5% of Native Americans consider themselves Christian. My friend Richard Twist, who died in 2013, wrote a book entitled 500 Years of Bad Haircuts. 500 years spent trying to make Native Americans something they were not, white. When the foundation of a country is white supremacy, it shapes the institutions of that particular country, which includes the Christian church. Evidence of how white supremacy shapes our church is the white images of Jesus that prevail in our sanctuaries, our books, and almost every aspect of our church. Just join me in this prayer before we begin with our questions. Lord, may we follow Jesus in the way that C.T. Vivian and John Lewis demonstrated in their own lives, willing to give their lives to free us from the bondage of racism. May we allow the Holy Spirit to shape us so that we can find ways to live together in a loving and just society. becoming the beloved community. Amen. I'm going to just quickly introduce our panelists. And then we're going to get to the questions. First, and just raise your hand or smile or whatever. So Glen Guyton is the Executive Director of Mennonite Church USA. He is the first person of color holding the position. Glen wrote a book entitled Ideal Me, Discovering Your Call in a Cluttered World, is for youth and young adults. He is a qualified administrator of the IDI and an international diversity and inclusion speaker. He was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Then we have Sue Park-Hur, denominational minister for Mennonite Church USA in charge of transformative peacemaking. Sue is also one of the co-founders of Reconciliation with her husband, Hinojosa. She has an MA in Christian Formation and Intercultural Studies from Wheaton College. She was born in Korea and raised in Los Angeles, California. Then we have Felipe Hinojosa, is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University at College Station, Texas. He has written a book entitled Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture, published in 2014. Felipe was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, where his father served as a Mennonite pastor for over 30 years. Felipe was also a Damascus Road trainer. Then we have Erica Littlewolf, is from the Cheyenne Reservation in Busby, Montana, where she was born and raised. She works for MCC as Indigenous Vision Center Coordinator. Erica participates in the UN Indigenous Forum, North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, and the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition. And then we have Tobin Miller Shearer. He is professor and director of African Studies at the University of Montana. Tobin, along with Regina Shan-Stolfus, co-founded Damascus Road Anti-Racism Training. One of Tobin's first books was entitled Enter the River, which explored white privilege. The book was published in 1994. Tobin was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Southern Ontario. So panelists, we're going to go on. We have two panelists. Each one had just, each question will be answered by two panelists. I think one of them, we have Tobin answering by himself, but other panelists can join in. So once the two answer, add anything else to what they're saying, please jump in. So the first one is Felipe and Erica. So how do we best listen to people of color?
You want me to go first? So first of all, thank you, Iris, and it's really great to be with everybody again. This has been a difficult week, difficult time, I think, for a lot of us, and especially with the passing of C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. It's hard for us to understand all of the things that seem to be happening seemingly all at once. I'll never forget being in the archives at Atlanta Clark University in Atlanta, Georgia, and looking at some of the documents there and finding a document of John Lewis having signed off a contribution that he was making to a voting rights organization in South Texas. And that for me was, I get chills just now thinking about it in terms of somebody as significant and as important as John Lewis standing in solidarity with other marginalized groups. I think it was what he was all about. And so in sort of thinking about that and starting off that way, I think one of the most important things, and really to take a nod from the work that he and C.T. Vivian did, is in terms of that listening part. I think a big part of it is doing the work. There, you know, so in the 90s, I was a big part of doing short-term mission programs. My church would host white youth from all across the Midwest to come to South Texas and the border region. And me and other church leaders would help organize and host and all of that, and take people to different parts of, South Texas and northern Mexico in an education. Short-term missions was a big thing. I'm not sure if that's still going on in the way it was, but back then it was. And it was also hugely debated. I mean, I wrote a piece, very controversial piece in the early 2000s in taking a stand against short-term missions. But I remember everybody that would leave the experience, all of these white kids from the Midwest, being very sort of struck by what they had seen, committed to making a change and to making a difference. And I think to a large extent, what that means is not necessarily just saying it or saying that you're going to listen to people's stories, but it's doing the work. It's really about doing the work. And I know folks from that era that today are doing incredible and fantastic work as allies, reading what they have to read, out there marching, doing the work in the churches and being advocates. And for me, there could be nothing more important, than that. I think there's something, sometimes people get off the hook by just saying, well, I'm just here to listen and I'm not going to say anything. And I just want to hear your story. I want you to tell me. And that's, I mean, okay, all right, that's fine. But I also want to hear from you. This has to be an exchange. We have to have a mutual exchange here. And I want to know what you're doing. I want to know where your commitments are, and what it is that you're contributing, to our community. And that, by the way, I mean, we're talking specifically here about white people and listening to people of color and taking that lead. I mean, when we were in Damascus Road, one of the big points that we made was that people of color within the organization should have veto power. And I still believe that very, very strongly. I think at the same time, speaking to my community, to the Latino community, we've got a lot of work that we need to do as well in terms of the kinds of listening that we need to do from our African-American brothers and sisters, Asian American brothers and sisters, Native American folks, in terms of trying to understand other people's experiences within our own. So, and again, I think it has everything to do with, being willing to do the work and to commit ourselves to saying, I'm going to read, I'm going to go and try to educate myself. I'm going to stand in solidarity with people. I'm going to donate where I need to donate, and not just sort of passively listen once again to people's story. But I think that it's a great way to start, because I think that's what people are asking. I get a lot of students, and with this I'll shut up, but I get a lot of students, Latino students especially, that in this moment are coming to me and saying, I want to know, I'm so inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to know about my history. And I think that's the beauty of all of this, is that people are inspired by Black Lives Matter and standing in solidarity, and then turning around and saying, I want to know about my people and where we're at in all of this and where we stand. And I know that was transformative for me. And that's what, in terms of thinking about these short-term mission experiences, that's what it fueled within me, is to say, I need to find out what's going on within my own community.
Thank you, Felipe. Yes, to everything that you said. I think I would add, in addition to what Felipe shared, and speaking specifically for Indigenous people, I'm Northern Cheyenne, Native American people. I think the listening is different. Listening also does involve speaking, as Felipe has mentioned. And I would say that listening for Native people involves listening not necessarily through your ears. It involves listening through your heart. Not so much listening for the analytics, but listening for the feelings behind the words. and listening for the emotions, watching the nonverbals, watching the things that happen that fall between the words, the silence, leaving room for silence, and different things like that. And I would also say that, along with what Felipe has voiced, that it's always interesting, especially when white people come to our communities and they say, we're just here to listen. But you talk a lot by not talking. You know, it's like always these tense postures, you know, it's like whenever we bring up our spirituality and your body's tense, and there's always the over grabbing or the, all these different ways that are domineering with the body. And so I think those are ways that speak sometimes louder than words and show that you aren't listening. I think there's ways, I like to do talking circles, especially in Indigenous communities. It makes deliberate space for people. So you're not arguing for space to speak. It allots space and time that everyone can contribute to the conversation, and equalizes the time in which people are allotted. I think that is what actually comes to mind when I think about that question.
Do any of the other panelists want to add anything? Okay, go to our second question. This is for Eric. What role does intersectional work have in moving toward liberation?
You starting, Erica, or you want me to start?
I guess I can start. I find it interesting because we came up with some Undoing Patriarchy curriculum, and I had always been a trainer with the Damascus Road anti-racism training. And we had always dreamed that we would do this intersectional work and add the intersection of sexism. But the interesting thing is I felt that I could always show up. But it wasn't until I did this Undoing Patriarchy curriculum that I felt extremely vulnerable, because it was the first space in which I felt like I could actually show up as an Indigenous woman. Because in most spaces, people only acknowledge me as being Indigenous or Native American, not that I have an experience all of my own as an Indigenous woman, which is extremely different than an Indigenous man. So I think the intersectional work is necessary. If we leave it only at a race narrative, I feel like we're only benefiting white people. And it's when we start hitting those intersections that we start to truly benefit people of color, that we start really dissecting and getting at the people that are most oppressed. It felt odd to be fully seen. It felt odd to get at the ways oppression has affected me. And most particularly like around Indigenous women with murdered and missing Indigenous women. There's over 5,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women, and this phenomenon happens North America, South America, Canada, US, and this phenomena is particular to Indigenous women, and there are reasons why this happens. This doesn't happen to Indigenous men. And so these are what we mean by intersection. So why is this happening to Indigenous women and not to Indigenous men? Yeah, and I think the work is necessary. I would value that work.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, I think it's very important that we look at the framework of intersectionality as we think about people or a group of people or the social problems that are affecting us, because there are a number of discriminations and disadvantages that come together as we think about racism, sexism, all of the other isms. And so, you know, we have overlapping experiences, overlapping identities, as Erica alluded to. And I liked that Erica's added the part about just kind of benefiting white people, because as we think about intersectionality, there are some overlaps in the oppressions that we all face. This is not to say that we neglect some of the pressing issues, but it allows us to see where some of our disadvantages and oppressions intersect. So that could be race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, if we are working with other groups, and other identity markers. And so part of the concept of this was originated by a Black woman. Black women were left out of the civil rights movement to a large extent, but we have to recognize, the complexity and the convergence of oppression in our systems, in our settings. I wanted to refer to something Dr. King wrote, or one of his speeches, where he talks about another form of intersectionality. And I'm just going to read what he said. 3 major evils: the evil of racism, the evil of poverty, and the evil of war. These are 3 things that I want to deal with today. Now, let us first turn to the evil of racism. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that racism is alive all over America. Racial injustice is still the Negro's burden and America's shame. We must face the hard fact that many Americans would like to have a nation which is a democracy for white Americans, but simultaneously a dictatorship over Black Americans. We must face the fact that we still have much to do in the area of race relations. But Dr. King brought in those other aspects of our identity, that socioeconomic status, which is, again, a part of this convergence of oppression. And so as we think about poor people, Dr. King says, and so often we allow them to become invisible because our society is so affluent that we don't see the poor. And so as some of the things that we attribute to race or ignorance, all of these things may be a confluence of different types of oppression. And then Dr. King, in his prophetic wisdom, talked about militarism and the Vietnam War and its disruptive nature on shifting resources and attention away from the needs of American people. So think about that now in the context of the federalization of our police force, the news and the rhetoric about law and order, how that confluence of things that Dr. King talked about back in the late 60s is coming to play now. All those things are merging together. So we have the intersections of identity that we have to think about, and also the intersection of these socioeconomic, political, and philosophies that are all coming together to heighten the oppression that's going on. And I think that just one other thing Martin Luther King said, he says, in dealing with the race problem, I think it is so often anthropocentric rather than theocentric. And I think about that in relation to the church. We are focused so much on, what other people will think, about changing our culture, losing something of ourselves, that we forget about how God sees us and what God would have us do as a church. And so I think we need to contemplate that, especially as we deal with LGBTQ people. We set this us versus them narrative, same things we do with race, same things we do with gender. We've made these broad stereotypes in order to isolate people when we're very diverse. All of those groups are very diverse and have probably many similarities that we have in our lives and our values. So we just need to think about intersectionality, how that plays out. What are the many different things that come together to define who people are, and even maybe where we can connect with people in various aspects of their lives.
Any additional feedback from the other?
I was just gonna just step in real quick and just say that I think especially for the call from Chicana feminists during the civil rights movement was not just one about more inclusion, although that was huge, obviously, as Glenn mentioned, in terms of the marginalization that women faced in the movement, but it was also a complete reorientation of how we think about the history. The women were calling us to go back to the colonial period, to look at, to what you started us out today, Iris, in terms of Jack D. Forbes and his work, to look at the rape of indigenous women and to look at sort of the making of mestizos, this sort of mixture and blending of Spanish and indigenous populations, because it was the women that were blamed for that, right? That it was La Malinche that had sold out Native women and indigenous women in Mexico, and then had given up basically and opened the door for Spanish colonialism. Chicanas were about a complete rethinking of the women during the colonial period, and really forced us to look further back. And I do also want to say a shout out to las hermanas Menonitas Evangélicas within our own church, and Carlos, who's translating, knows this very well. Maria Rivera de Snyder was an active woman in the church back in the 70s. And in the Latino Spanish language Ecos Menonitas, it was Maria, who was a trained nurse, who was writing about health issues that impacted women, specifically reproductive labor, domestic work of women, not just about whether women should be pastors or not. It was about what's going on in the home. And she was really a trailblazer in that regard. And I think Las Hermanas were critical in pushing Latino and African-American men really too, to think about the fact that if we are just focusing on race, we're missing a big part of what's happening in terms of oppression.
Thank you, Felipe. So Tobin, your question is kind of a big question, but it's a question, like, we've been getting this question all week. Well, I have through the email. Is how do we begin a conversation about white supremacy?
Yeah.
Typically in white congregations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely critical question. And probably one of the places to start is simply to define what we mean in this context when we talk about white supremacy. That term has often been used in the past to talk about men wearing white hoods, the KKK or the skinheads, etc. But the context we're using it here, we're talking about a system that's been designed to ensure that people who look like me are put in positions of privilege and are assumed to be superior to people who don't look like me. And so that's the context that I think we want to be centering on. The question of white nationalism is also important, but it's not the immediate question. And I and my colleagues have argued for many years that in terms of the experience of people of color in this country, the experience of hate groups is extremely marginal in terms of shaping oppression and shaping privilege. It's the systems of healthcare and real estate and economics that are actually affecting people's lives. And that's what white supremacy is about. How do we begin those conversations? So in my work, I end up talking to a lot of white people about white supremacy. And I just noticed a couple of things that have worked over the years and things that haven't worked. And I'll just name a couple of them. One is I no longer set out to try to convince other white folks of anything. That's not my agenda when I'm talking about white supremacy. All I want to make sure is that the ideas I have to share about the way white supremacy operates in society are understandable, and let the ideas do the work themselves rather than trying to enter in a conversation where I've got the right answer and the person I'm talking with doesn't. And once I let go of trying to convince them, all kinds of things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. So that's been a learning that I've sort of also identified over time. Also being able to talk and recognize that in our country today, in the main, white folks and members of the BIPOC community, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, have historically through to the present talked about race in fundamentally different ways, where the BIPOC community has talked about race systemically in the way I've just talked about, And the white community, when we talk about race, which is usually very rarely, unless crisis emerges, we usually talk about an interpersonal phenomenon. Did we say bad words? Did we use a racial epithet? Recognizing those are different conversations can help us recognize as white folks that we have to learn to listen, as our colleagues just reminded us, to the way in which that systemic conversation unfolds, and to retune ourselves and retool ourselves to be able to have that conversation. That's the second thing. I'll just name two more. One is I find myself returning time and time and again to the principle of integrity as a point of connection with those who perhaps not have thought about racism in a concentrated and focused way. To suggest that for those of us in the white community who are members of Mennonite Church, of other faith communities, racism undermines our faith and mission because we are not able to fulfill the Great Commission. We're not able to connect across racial lines as we are called to do because of this racism that's prohibiting us. For those who care about the Republic and the ideals of democracy, racism intervenes in our ability to have integrity with that. So many other ways we can explore the idea of integrity, and I found folks who might not otherwise really consider this conversation to open up when we get to that. The final thing I'll just suggest is, as I've talked with other white folks, I've had to learn a skill. This is not something that comes naturally a lot of times. It's something that happens when we are investing time and energy and doing our work, like Felipe suggested earlier, so that we can talk systemically. We can. I have prepared myself to have examples about the way racism operates in the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, in the real estate practice, that I hope can be helpful. Again, not to try to convince others or guilt trip them into having ideas about racism, but rather to be able to consider that there's something bigger than simply have I said a bad word today that's directed in a negative way towards a person of color. The only other comment I'll add, which is connected to conversation about white supremacy, but also to the conversation about intersectionality, is in my experience, those of us who are white often want to turn to every other possible oppression or identity marker other than race. And so I think even as we recognize, and this is the principle of binomiality that I've learned from the womanist community, that two things can be true. We have to be intersectional, but we also, as white folks, have to be very careful that we're not using the intersectional conversation to turn our attention away from the work that we have to do as white folks, as women and men, in order to understand what it is that's happening to us from that racial identity. We got to do both. It's not an either or.
Okay.
That's where it comes in, that you have to have communities of color then organizing and doing our own work separate. This is what we did in Damascus Road, where we would separate and have these things, because that intersectionality to us is significant and it does matter, even as race is central in that conversation. But that was one of the things that, as Tobin just mentioned that right now, that went off as a light bulb, because you have to be able to do that work separately in order to come back together.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the whole image that we used to use in Damascus Road of we go apart in order to be able to come back together better. And if we don't do that separate work, we're usually not going to be able to be together really well. And so that's an important part of the conversation as well. Thanks, Steve.
Any other comments on?
Hey, Iris, I will say, just I know a lot of people are watching. Somehow the license got changed for Zoom in between these meetings, so we only have 100 people or 101 people that are allowed to see this on this venue. But of course, people can join in on Facebook. I just want to make sure we clear that up, because people were trying to get on and couldn't.
Okay, thank you. All right. The next question is for Felipe and Sue. This is another question that people, it would be nice to have a nice pat answer, but as we know, when we're talking about race, there are no pat answers. So this one is, what role does racial healing and reconciliation play in being anti-racist?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult. Thanks for that great simple question. I was thinking about an image from John 5 where Jesus meets a man in Bethesda, right? And he goes to this man who's been paralyzed for 38 years and says, you know, like, do you want to get well? Do you want to be healed? And that sounds like a ridiculous question, but in racial healing or the conversation around this, do we want to be well as a church? We've received emails from, you know, from our constituents or from people, even pastors who are ordained by or licensed by MCUSA. Like, why are we so focused on social justice and this racial talk when we should be sharing about the gospel? And that helps me to kind of diagnose where we're at, right? Not everyone is there, but I think that conversation is also happening. Like, can we name that we are sick and need of healing? To deny and disconnect ourselves from the fact that white supremacy has made us all sick, that racism is a systemic evil that has harmed our BIPOC brothers and sisters in the church, that it has caused moral injury to white Christians. Do we want to be healed from this white supremacy? Is a question that I wanted to throw out there. And the word reconciliation is an important one, so much that my husband and I kind of did a play on word of this and started a nonprofit. It's a vision that Paul wrote, right, about the message and the ministry of reconciliation that we have been entrusted with. And I believe this is a vision and calling for Christ followers. It's kind of an ongoing and mission to restore wholeness and peace that Tobin had talked about in a world that's broken by systemic injustice. And so in order to do this, we must look at white supremacy because it distorts the image of God inherent in all people. But like many Christian concepts and vision that are beautiful and wonderful, the concept and the word reconciliation has been weaponized. It's important, but it has wounded many people because the ones with power who insist that we should forgive and forget what happened in the past, and to kind of, put this blanket over with good kumbaya feeling moments, like I feel good, this interpersonal relationship that needs to be mended that Tobin also talked about. That is not reconciliation. For true reconciliation or racial healing, we have to look at what needs to be done. And one way that we can look at it is what I think Mennonites are famous for and are familiar with. The restorative justice model is one where we really focus on who has been hurt, what are their needs, whose obligations are these, and this language and conversation of reconciliation must come from those who have been harmed. And particularly as we were talking about intersectionality, we need to really hear and center this concept of healing and racial reconciliation by, I think, women of color who have been most marginalized and know how the systems prevent them from reaching, wholeness. And so in order for us to do that, I think there has to be a reckoning of history, brutal truth-telling, and the weight of the history, how it has impacted our lives, our bodies, claiming our voices through this reckoning and hearing the complex and hard stories. Even in our churches, right? Vincent Harding, we claim him, and yet there have been, it's a complex relationship where we have also harmed him to a point where he left. And so we want to, again, sanitize a lot of our really rocky roads towards reconciliation. And I think as we deal with, in this process of reconciliation, we need there needs to be healing, and we need to see healing of those who are most marginalized. And there needs to be a repentance and conversion. And this is, I think, where reparation comes in the process of reconciliation. And as we do that, we continue to build the beloved community.
In the Damascus Road process, one of the exercises that we first started out with, we used an iceberg as a metaphor to talk about racism. And the first exercise, I think it was that first evening, was that we had people grab markers, and there were books at different time periods, and there were 3 or 4 icebergs that represented different time periods in the history of the Americas. And people were then to take a marker and to write whatever they know about that historical time period, and write acts of racism within that iceberg, and then acts of resistance outside of that iceberg. That for me, that beginning, and then we would end with that experience, you know, asking people what they learned, what they want to know more about, what they didn't know. And that for me was always a reconciling process. It was always a process where, you know, we were going deep, primarily because we were not just acknowledging the sin of racism and the way that it's operated in our society, but for me, the reconciling happened when we were talking about those acts of resistance. And one of the central mantras that we had was that just as racism continually has evolved and changed across time, there have always been acts of resistance. And for me, that when we talk about anti-racism and when we talk about reconciliation, when there are people marching, when there are protesters out there, when there are people that are doing everything that they can to trip up white supremacy, doing everything that they can to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare, that everyone has access to education and can live in a safe neighborhood and so forth, all of that is beautiful and reconciling. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the kind of work that we do and what it is that we're committed to. The book that you mentioned that I wrote and published in 2014, Latino Mennonites, the beautiful thing about that that book, I had one reviewer came back to me and said, I wish there were more stories about white Mennonites in this book. And you know, my response was that I can describe white Mennonite racism in an entire book. I'm more interested in those stories of resistance and in the complex narratives that those stories created. The fact that somebody like Neftali Torres, who was Afro-Latino, is being questioned about his identity. Are you Latino or are you Black? You know, those kinds of things, when you talk to people who gave their entire lives to the church in the 1960s and in the 1970s, to be able to talk to them and have them feel like somebody cares and somebody is listening to them. And it's not just me, it's everybody that has participated in that process and others that have written, Tobin, Regina, and others that have done that work. I think that's that reconciling part. And I'm thinking totally like a nerd here because I'm talking about academic work or research or getting stories and doing this sort of stuff. But it matters. You know, whatever kind of reviews I got for that book, nothing mattered to me more than the support that I got from the people that I wrote about. And I'm gonna cry right now. But just, you know, the phone calls and the emails and the folks signing and saying, thank you, this was reconciling, this was healing for me. I needed this based on everything that we've suffered through in terms of racism in the church.
Thank you, Felipe. Does anyone else want to add anything to this? Before we go on to the next question, I did notice someone posted a question about the intersectionality piece. I think part of it is we probably assumed that most people know what it is. This person said, I think basically they were asking for a basic definition of that. Intersectionality of what? So I don't know if either Erica or Glenn just want to give the simple definition of what we're talking about when we talk about intersectionality.
I'll give you one and maybe someone else can give a better one. Intersectionality is a framework for conceptualizing a group or person's problems as affected by a number of discriminations and disadvantages. So we talk about multiple identity factors. the intersection of being a woman, the intersection of being a person of color, the intersection of being poor. So these different identity factors come together in an overlapping fashion as we think about discrimination and disadvantages. They don't work in isolation. They intersect as you think about issues that are facing. And I had a discussion, I'll give you a perfect example. I had a discussion with some people on Facebook when we think about crime. Well, you know, the popular argument that anytime something goes on with Black people, well, what about Chicago? What about Black on Black crime? Do Black lives really matter? And I say, if you really look at the data, it's really poverty is one of the contributing factors to crime. LeBron James is not out here robbing banks. It's poor Black people, it's poor white people. We tend to rob people that are close by. You don't take an Uber to go rob someone. And so the intersectionality is a person of color probably has a greater chance of being in poverty. And so you have a higher percentage of people of color doing crime because they're in a higher level of poverty, just like you have more poor white people committing crimes than you do upper middle class white people. And so those are some things you think about when you think of intersectionality.
Thank you, Glenn. Anyone else want to contribute to that piece? Okay, well, I hope we answered the question for the person. We're going on to question number 5, which is Sue and Glenn. How, and this is for people of color, how do we take care of ourselves while fighting the fight as people of color?
Well, you know, I'm a pastor, and I always say, choose your topics wisely, because, you know, like if you're going to be talking and preaching about forgiveness, like that whole week, you're going to be dealing with a lot of unforgiving people and a lot of mess, right? And so when we were talking, you know, when I was given this question to kind of wrestle with, I got really sick. I got really, really sick last week. And so let me just tell you, with embodied wisdom here, we need to take care of our bodies. During this pandemic, we're realizing that there are health disparities amongst BIPOCs, and it puts us at higher risk of and susceptible to all the pandemic and you know, because we have chronic illnesses such as diabetes, blood pressure, obesity, lack of access to healthcare. And so, and then compounded to that, like people of color are also disproportionately represented among essential workers and service workers in hospitals and markets and other places where we are more at risk to contact the virus. And compounded to that, I think, as for me as an Asian person, I also am aware of the increasing anti-Asian racism that's pervasive. So I have to put on a mask and then also think about all of these other things that are happening. And I'm realizing that it has impacted my body. So we carry these racialized trauma in our bodies, and we as embodied beings, we need to care for our bodies. And for me, growing up as an immigrant, many of us, I didn't grow up with a lot of model of rest and taking care of my body. I've been taught you have to work, study, you know, twice as hard to make it in America. And so I have this like nonstop, my body is really not for me to you know, take care of. It's to be used for the next thing. You know, my parents left for work at 7 in the morning and they came back at 8 o'clock at night. And this culture of self-sacrifice, of not holding my body, is also reinforced in the church, right? We talk about being a living sacrifice, persevering, you know, giving it all. And like, you know, for Asians, we have this morning prayer. Koreans have this morning prayer. So this lack of sleep, you have to wake up at 5 in the morning, go to church, you know, and then you start your work from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock again. And so we've been taught to not take care of our bodies. And so even though I'm trying to fight that, my kind of default mode is that I don't take care of my bodies. And again, this intersectionality as a woman, I'm also taking care of other people. And that's also culturally kind of assumed. And so please, we need to take care of our bodies. The second thing that I would like to add is that we need to surround ourselves with people to check our sanity. We need to take care of our mental health because we have experienced trauma, and that gets triggered at unexpected times and unexpected places. And so I need to, when I see something, and if I'm the only person of color in certain situations, like, am I being overly sensitive? You know, like, I'm not sure if I'm making a big deal out of it. But then if there are others, and I tell them, like, was I crazy? You know, and Iris will say, no, you weren't crazy. It kind of helps me to understand, and it gives me a sense of centeredness. So, whether that's a group of friends, finding a therapist, going to retreats, or even finding a spiritual director. Did you guys know that there is a spiritual director of Color Network that Shannon Dykes had mentioned to me? So there are resources for us to connect and take good care of ourselves. And at such a time when we are compounded with so many different layers of heaviness, we're holding a lot, and our body keeps the score. And so we must take good care of our bodies and our minds.
All right. Yes, Sue, take care of yourself. You know, your boss has told you that many times.
And you guys have been great in supporting my need of rest.
All right. Yeah, really good point, Sue, especially about that support system. I think we all need that. And sometimes people of color don't believe in going to get help or therapy or getting counseling, but that is so important. And there are a number of, my former students who are now therapists, people of color that can really help you and understand. So don't neglect your mental health. One of the other things I would say is don't be Black Jesus. That's what I would say to me. You know, if you are from a different group, fill that in, but don't be Black Jesus. It's not your job to save anyone or to change people's minds when it comes to this conversation on race. So I would encourage my brothers and sisters out there to put your cape away. You have no obligation to be re-traumatized or to justify this racist system that we are a part of. Don't feel like you are the person that needs to fix 400 plus years of oppression. I would also encourage you just to take a break from social media and from toxic relationships. You may have to cut some people loose. And you say, well, that's not the Christian thing to do. I think it is, because you can only take so much crap in your life. And I'll give you a scripture to back that up. Luke chapter 13, verse 6 through 8. It's the parable of the fig tree. It says a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard. And when he came looking, seeking fruit on it and found none, then he said to the keeper of the vineyard, look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree and found none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? But he answered and said to him, sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and fertilize it, to put some crap on it, right? And if it bears fruit, well, but if not, then after that, you can cut it down. After you've gone through all this crap for so many years, eventually you just have to cut it loose, right? You just got to cut it loose. So cut some of those toxic relationships that you've poured in over and over again. You may have to cut some people loose, and that's your scripture to back that up. The other thing is don't sell yourself short. We have libraries now. We have Google. We have paid experts, people like Tobin, Dr. Hinojosa down there. So many people to help you understand, to help other people understand the complexities and history of racism and systemic oppression. And so you don't have to be the one to educate everyone. That's not your responsibility. At some point, people are going to have to take responsibility for their own learning. So don't get dragged into every conversation or to feel like they're going to put you on stage as the token person of color to fix their racism, hey, I just need to talk to somebody and get some knowledge. No, there are plenty of people they can talk to. They can Google. I have a couple of $100 worth of books I bought on Amazon that I use to enhance my learning and study. Other people can do that too.
Thank you. I just want to add just a little quick story to this whole thing about taking care of ourselves. I think it was last month when I went for my physical to see my doctor, and she's a person of color. So I walk into the room, and a few minutes later, she comes in, and we look at each other, and we both start crying. And we realized, for me, I realized that this situation of the overt racism that's been going on for the last 3 years really was affecting me. And I really never let my emotions out, and it was the same thing for her. She said, I don't know how much more I can take this. And at that point I realized I just need to not watch so much TV anymore. Around, to see the incidents happening to Black and brown, Asian people, and indigenous people just over and over and over again, it was really having an effect, and I was having anxiety attacks. And I told her, I said, what is this? And she said, you're having anxiety attacks. And she says, and then she tells me that she's also been having them also. But it does, sometimes we don't even realize how it's affecting our bodies. And I think these acts that go on day after day and they're put on the TV, part of me says it's important for people to see that. The other part is sometimes I wonder how, I know how it affects people of color, but I'm wondering, do I guess white people really understand not just the mental effect, but also the physical effect it has on our mind, our soul, and our body. So I just wanted to share that that's just, I'm thankful for my doctor in the sense that it was just kind of weird that I listened to her, she listened to me. I felt I should have got that visit for free, but anyway. But it was just good that I could talk to her, and then I began to realize I got to get those images, those day-to-day images out of my mind, because they were really, really dragging me to a place that was not good. Okay, so the next question is Felipe and Tobin. And we asked you this last time, but we didn't have a lot of time to answer it. And again, I got some questions too on the email about this. And again, it's a complex question. What would it look like for MCUSA congregations to practice racial reparations?
I went first last time, hermano.
All right, so let me, I think, so this idea of, and I think we might have mentioned it, either Tobin or I, that in 1968, 1969, the Black Manifesto was this call for white churches to contribute $500 million in reparations for the money that white religious institutions had made from the institution of slavery. There was a movement also within the Mennonite Church I think it was called the Compassion Fund, Tobin, if I remember, that John Powell and others, and it really was a call that every congregation was going to raise money toward this Compassion Fund to lead directly to the work of Black and brown people within the Mennonite Church. It never raised the money that they wanted to, but they did raise a little bit of it. It was obviously very, very controversial. It was presented at that controversial convention in Turner, Oregon in 1969. 1969 was just a controversial year just in general, and the Mennonite Church was in the thick of it as well. And that was one idea. The issue, I think, there was never much buy-in from congregations who also felt that maybe whoever was directing the Compassion Fund didn't necessarily have, or the accusation was that there wasn't necessarily a vision for what the money was going to be used for, or whatever, which is completely ridiculous, because I from what I understand, there was a pretty clear idea of what the money would be used for. But I think one of the things that that we need to be very intentional about is to make sure that that churches are prepared to participate in the development of leadership within this denomination that is not the same, white leadership that we've always had. And that's not to say that the white leadership that we've had hasn't taken us to great, places, or taken the denomination in good directions. That's just to say that we can't just expect more Black and brown people to be in those roles. We have to be proactive in what it is that we do. And I think, talking about the educational side of it, I think you need a church and a denomination, and you need congregations that are going to put money forth to develop and articulate a story and a narrative of non-white Mennonites. The entire look at what this Mennonite church is in terms of the history and so forth. Right now, I'm in conversations with some of the old Latino Mennonites that were around in the 60s and 70s who want more young people to engage in research. And Lupe de León in particular is trying to get folks together to see if he can raise some money and be able to say, can we create a fund so that students at our Mennonite colleges can get scholarships and funding to go and do research in different communities so that these stories can begin to be told. I think that's fabulous. I just don't want them to have to do all of it. I think churches need to step up, and we need a plan to be able to say, here's where churches need to step up and be able to contribute to build a body of knowledge. We have an archive that is there that has great documents from Native American, Asian American, Latino, African American groups that are in their international communities from all over the world that are there, but we don't have, our students don't have the necessary funding to be able to spend the time necessary to go there and to do that work. I know this is very professorial, but we have to create opportunities. If you're going to have all of these Mennonite essay contests that, you can win $500 to write another essay about the 16th century, do we need another one? Let's create competitions. Let's create opportunities for people to do research and to be able to write our stories and to be able to give students that are already at our colleges, students of color that are at our colleges, and otherwise, to be able to write down our stories and tell our narratives. If we want, to be a part of this, and they owe us, because there was a moment where Latinos wanted to establish a seminary in San Antonio, Texas, that was focused on developing a Latino Anabaptist focus. And white Mennonites are like, well, and they didn't do it like that, but I'm just, it was something around, if you're going to do Anabaptism, you've got to come to Goshen. You can't be in San Antonio and do Anabaptist theology. You've got to come to Goshen. The heck with that. We're done with that, right? Now the commitment should come from congregations to be able to create funds so that we can write the story, create our theologies, and do the work that we need to do. There's no reason why folks that are writing this theology shouldn't get the proper support to be able to take this, publish it, and create a body of knowledge, a collective historiography of what our stories are. In other words, books that tell our stories. We need more of that. How about that? Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Always a tough act to follow my brother Felipe. I'll just add a couple things. I think congregations and the denomination have the opportunity to model to the broader society the way that reparations can be done right. We've not been part of that so far, but we have theological resources, the principle of Jubilee. We have internal intergenerational wealth, which is one of the reasons that we need to have reparations. And we have been the beneficiary as white folks in the Mennonite Church of the principle of unjust enrichment, where we have moved on to native lands. We have participated in a society that has been built on the backs of enslaved Africans. There is every reason for us as a denomination and as congregations to follow that principle of Jubilee and to let go some of our resources and put them in the hands of communities of color to do what and take the envisioning kind of role academically, as Felipe has identified, but elsewhere in the broader church as a community. We have the opportunity to step into a leadership role and model what that can look like. That's our opportunity. Whether we'll step into or not, I think remains to be seen, but I think the church could do it well. I think I'll stop there with that.
And let me just add that to Tobin's point exactly, is to say that once, this pandemic, once we can come back together and see each other and be in church again, this thing is not over. The economic impact of this will be with us for years to come. And so the responsibility of churches to be able to step up and do the kind of work with that intergenerational wealth that Tobin was just pointing to, I think is going to be more important than ever in the next 5 to 10 years. Absolutely it is. And it's time. Churches need to be strategizing right now.
I mean, the other thing I'll add is a personal anecdote, and just to share how my partner and I, Cheryl and I, have decided to try to do this small little sliver, a symbol of reparations in our own life, in that I've been tasked by and asked by my colleagues of color to step into a role of doing anti-racism training, and as I have in the past, but in a much more public way right now. That's bringing some money in. And we've decided that that's not money we're going to keep. We are going to make that money and invest it in Black-led organizations, including Roots of Justice. And we'll talk about that, the organization, in a moment. But that's a principle of reparations that we're trying to live out in our own life. And it's not super costly for us. I want to be clear about that. We're both salaried. But it is a principle that we're trying to figure out, how can we do this on an individual level? And we need that collectivity as well, because if we just say it's a matter of individuals, we're not going to get there. We need to have the corporate action, the level of the church, hopefully at the level of the nation.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. I do appreciate Felipe talking about all of our histories. I think part of the danger that we've always faced when it comes to resources in this church is, we have one favored racial minority at a time. And so, we all have to compete for these resources. But I do hope that as we think about these ideas, we can work at them in a collective way, cohesive way that tells all of our stories. And I think Tobin, the other point he said is letting go. I think part of our trouble when we do this work, or when we think about reparations or reconciliation, we don't want to give up anything. There is a cost to move towards justice. A lot of people bled and died to get to where we are here. And so, shifting a couple of dollars here or there, or speaking out against injustice, those things are easy, I think, compared to what our forefathers had to endure in order to get us to this point. And I'm thankful for, I'm a product of mentorship of C3 Calvary Community Church. A pastor and a church took the time to pour into me. I even mentioned Titus Peachy often, a white Mennonite who befriended me and took the time to listen, but also get me involved and connected in projects. Those are the things that make a difference, and it takes time. I've been in this church since 1993. How many years is that? That's a long time. I was the young guy, and I'm the old guy. But so it takes time. These things take time, and it takes walking alongside of people and giving some of yourself Tobin is one of the people that also, poured into my life that, I had connections with. So those relationships are important in order to engage and navigate through the complexities of this church.
I think I would also add that for Native people, I think it's good, like if you can begin like with your church community, there's resources on the D of D Menno site that you can begin to understand the doctrine of discovery. And one place to start is to do the history of your church or the history of the land that you occupy, and to look at the tribes that you have displaced. One of the premises of the doctrine of discovery is this idea of terra nullius. And that idea is that if they knew that people were there, but because the people were not Christian, they were not considered human beings. And so the very act of doing a land acknowledgement is saying that you now recognize these indigenous people as being human beings, and that you recognize that you are living on indigenous land. And so I think that is one way of beginning to do the work of reparations. And I think Tobin mentioned it last time, also looking into that Shumi land tax. What would it mean to invest money into some of the local tribes and some of their historical centers and upkeeping their museums and doing different things like that?
Let me just, I love that idea, Erica. And I just want to highlight that, this is something that those congregational histories, the land, where you're at, there's already a base of knowledge in the community that can help to do a lot of that work. And you can even get the denomination to step in. There are a lot of really smart people. The denomination has an archivist in Elkhart that can go and look at documents that a church might have, maybe take photographs, or even help a church build an archive. What does it mean to put these things or organize or whatever it is? I think those are fabulous things. I mean, I know there's a lot of workshops on planting churches, and everybody, there's this and that. Let's get a workshop on what Erica just suggested right now on congregational histories. How do you do that? And how can you make it happen? I think there's a lot of good work already at the congregational level, but I know in a lot of churches that I've been a part of, the bulletins, nobody knows what to do with that. I asked my dad the other day, where are your sermons? I mean, all of these things that we should have been keeping track of in one way or another, so that in the future, somebody can have access to them and be able to do the work and to tell the story. And many times it's folks from within those congregations that are going to do it best.
There. Okay, thanks. I think we have some questions, and we're going to get to those in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to spend some time letting you know, we know there's just so much more information that people want to know about, that need to learn, especially congregations on this issue, and finding ways for them to plug into their own communities. So Tobin, if you could just announce about, you're going to have an online class that people can audit or get credit for. You could just give a little information about that. And then I'll talk about the other resources that we're going to have.
So you're talking about Waterstand Consulting?
No, I'm talking about the class.
Oh, the class, yeah. Yeah, I'm teaching a class called Dismantling Racism from Theory to Practice through the University of Montana that actually starts on Monday. It's open to anyone in the country that wants to take it, that takes these ideas and develops them. It's not a faith-based training, but is a great way to equip people to be part of it. Very accessible, highly interactive. Just costs about $75 a person. That's another opportunity that's out there.
The other thing is that Mennonite Church USA, we're working on a resource page. I should say Sue and Kayla are working on it. But some of the things that are going to be on that resource page, we're going to have one page, thanks to Tobin, it's a glossary page. And these are terms that we've been using a lot since Damascus Road. A lot of those, some are new, but at least it gives everyone a chance to have a definition of those terms so that when we're talking with each other, we're talking on the same page and not across or past each other. So that will be one of the resource page. The other one is that we've partnered with Tobin's nonprofit, Wider Stand, and we're going to be able to provide congregations the opportunity to do, there's 4 modules for congregations on anti-racism, from doing audits, what to do after a training, trying to think of all of them. What do you do with the backlash when that happens in a congregation? And I can't remember the very first one. Tobin?
It's the most meaty one. It's about developing a language and an analytical framework and theological resources for dismantling racism, specifically in congregations. It's designed for congregations alone.
So this is designed for congregations, specifically white congregations. And so that will be, the information about that will be on our resource page. We'll also be doing some educating on opportunities for our agencies, for MCUSA staff, and for conference leaders. Also, Roots of Justice. In September, they hope to have their training online. Because of COVID-19, they haven't been able to have their regular trainings. So now they've going to move to the platform of putting it online. So once that gets online, we will let everyone know. That even makes it easier for people to get trained and have the same analysis about racism. Also, tonight, there's another webinar after ours. Racism is Real dialogue series. Black Women Talk Back. So, and Roots of Justice will be having that. And I think you can watch it live on Facebook. It's from 8 to 9 Eastern Standard Time. So I just want to make those quick announcements there about what we have. So I do also want to say these words of John Lewis. This quote, yeah, I think it's just one of the best quotes. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something, to say something, and not be quiet. And we know as Mennonites, we've been known as quiet in the land, but this is not the time to be quiet in the land. We need your voice, and we need the support to really work at this. So I'm going to take a look and see what the questions are that people put up. Doctor Discovery Coalition is in the process of developing a resource to support us all to do repair and reparations work. So I think that's just an announcement that they're working on some additional curriculum. Doctor Discovery, we do have their curriculum on our site, website, on just the basic understanding of what the doctrine of discovery is. And I think, if I'm correct, Erica, you're on that video. And so that's still on there. So now they're working on some additional resourcing around repair and reparation. So when that comes out, we'll also let you know. The other one was they appreciate Felipe and Tobin's comment. Can you recommend any Mennonite resources written by non-white Mennonite authors? I know Latino Mennonites and Tobin's Daily Demonstrators, but it is hard to find other resources.
I don't know. Maybe that's something we can ask Mental Media to make us a list. We have some other Anabaptists, but I don't know about Mennonites, and I don't know if resources. And my book is coming out soon with Mental Media, so you can pick that up when it comes out.
Yeah, I don't I'm trying to think at the top of my head, and
Yeah.
uh,
That may be a good, I don't know if Amy is watching, but that's a question that we've gotten a couple of times. And so maybe we can, ask Media to compile a list for us and put it on their website or something. So we'll check in.
Somebody just pointed to Drew Hart's The Trouble I've Seen, certainly. But I think
he's Anabaptist, not Mennonite, though. So
yeah, right.
He always says that. So
but I think that highlights the central problem, and it's not that our colleges and universities are not teaching this. I mean, I know a lot of great history profs across our colleges that are doing really fantastic work, and students that are writing these papers, but they stay as papers and they don't ever sort of make it into a broader circulation.
oh, I see. Someone also talked about Searching for Sacred Ground, the journey of Chief Lawrence Hart. And I'm trying to remember if that's something that Lawrence wrote himself or someone wrote about Lawrence. So if someone knows, I can't remember, but I know that Lawrence has been a big influence around Native American thinking theologically as an Anabaptist. Again, probably a lot of his stuff didn't get published. And I'm sure he probably still has a lot of that. So that's, again, Felipe, it goes to the point of here we have these people that have done a lot of good thinking about what it means to be Anabaptist, but does it mean as an indigenous person? Or what does it mean as a Latinx? Or what does it mean as an African American or Asian person? I mean, I think those are things that we know that we have the talent and we have the brains and we had people think, but we've never had the resources to get those things published and to get those things out so that others can be aware of what the thinking is out there.
So we had a question. They said, "What is the title of my book?" So it's going to be a while. It's still kind of like in production with Mental Media, but it's Reawakened: How Your Congregation Can Spark Lasting Change. That's the title. That's the working title of the book.
I think one I was just thinking was Vincent Harding's book, as well as a possible. There is a river, and I think his. So that's one that I wanted to share. For hey, Jung. I know she's doing her PhD work, and so she's probably frantically looking for scholarly resources.
Well, I guess I don't. Oh, we have some more questions. Okay, here we go. Oh, yeah, I do know they talked about Raylene Penner wrote it based on interviews with Lawrence, so that it was about Lawrence, but in an interview fashion with Raylene Penner wrote that. I guess talking about Mennonite World Conference, I think, those pieces are important. The global Mennonite history. I'll just say, as a person of color in the U.S., and even in our colleges, when we talk about diversity, mainly it's a lot easier for people to talk about and to read about and to lift up international people than it is people of color within their own country. So, I think that work was important or is important. Also, Wilma Bailey wrote a book. Thank you, Jacob, for bringing this up. You Shall Not Kill or You Shall Not Murder. I forgot about that, but Wilma Bailey wrote that.
And this one of the books I first read was The Black Mennonite Church in North America. So this is old. This just only goes to 1986. I was still in high school.
And
But that's a good history, though.
there's a counterpart Hispanic Mennonite history as well that Rafael Falcon wrote in that same series, I think it was.
Well, the other question was, has there been a book written about the history of Mennonite church struggles with racism, like The Color of Mennonites? I haven't seen a book, but I do know that when the archives had a historical committee, they used to put out a newsletter. And I think it was the year that we were, gosh, I want to say in Charlotte, Vincent Harding, they put out a really extensive article, not just on Vincent Harding, but of the church and the white Mennonite church and the struggle they had during the civil rights movement. That there were Mennonites really dedicated to see that through, but most of the church was not ready. And I thought it was a wonderful article. It's probably in the archive somewhere, but that mainly spoke to the white church and its struggle to embrace the civil rights movement.
We have Black and Mennonite by Hubert Brown. That's another one. Couple of books that are on my bookshelf. So yeah.
Oh, geez. Okay. Okay, I think we answered that one. Okay. Well, our time is just about up. I don't know if any of the panelists that are left have any final words to say. I'll give you one last chance. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. I've worked with many of you guys throughout the years, and I miss seeing you guys because of COVID-19. We can't see each other, but it's always great to be together. And even in spite of all that's been going on in the last, well, forever, but just the intensity in the last 3 years, I also have hope. I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful that people have been awakened in some way, in some fashion, to the reality of our country. It's a country that we all love, and it's a church that we all love. But because we love both our country and we love our church, we want it to be the best that it can, and we know we're not there yet. So, Glenn, I don't know if you have final word, or Sue or Felipe.
Thank you all for joining and participating in this, and you can share the video. It'll be on Facebook.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I
Take good care of yourselves.
And a special thank you to Carlos for the translating.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. Gracias.
Thank you, Carlos.
Here. Okay, well, goodbye, everyone. Have a good evening. And if you can join the next webinar with Roots of Justice on their Facebook page, join them. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.